Defying the age-old unspoken rule in Washington that incoming freshman members of Congress should be seen but not heard, Elizabeth Warren is taking the nation's Capitol by storm. Last Thursday may have been Valentine's Day, but Senator Warren showed no love for Wall Street at her first hearing as a member of the Senate Banking Committee, where she pushed bank regulators to answer the simple question: when was the last time you took a Wall Street bank to trial?
Tell me a little bit about the last few times you've taken the biggest financial institutions on Wall Street all the way to a trial. Anybody? I appreciate that you say you don't have to bring them to trial. My question is, when did you bring them to trial?
We have not had to do it as a practical matter to achieve our supervisory goals.
Can you identify when you last took the Wall Street banks to trial?
I will have to get back to you with the specific information.
While the video has become a YouTube sensation with over 1 million hits in under a week, the banking community is less than thrilled. According to Politico, one top Wall Street executive called Warren's performance at the hearing shameless grandstanding, while others on Wall Street took issue with Warren's claim that nobody believes that bank books are honest. But that is not stopping Senator Warren. Even though the Senate is in recess, Warren is taking her message home to Massachusetts, where this weekend she told constituents in the Bay State, "You can't come into people's neighborhoods and just tear them up. You can't sell terrible mortgage products that cause people to lose their homes. You can't come into our economy and just wreck it, cost people jobs, cost people their savings, cost people their retirements, and then say at the end, we're too big to touch." If Warren's performance isn't sitting well with Wall Street, it seems to be resonating with the rest of America. Years after the largest financial crisis in U.S. history, Warren raises an important question: why haven't banks been held accountable? Ryan, the Huffington Post has seen some traffic, shall we say, on this, and you've been covering it. A lot of people didn't know what to expect from Elizabeth Warren when she came into the Senate, but she is doing it Yosemite Sam style.
Right, and this is something that's fine within the Senate culture because, she waited her turn at the hearing for a freshman, and she asked very simple questions. She wasn't asking about collateralized, securitized debt obligations or any other tranches or anything. It's just, when was the last time you took a bank to trial? That's it. And the simplicity of it is what I think has pushed it well past 1 million views. And you'll notice that at the hearing, it also allowed some of the other Democrats to be a little bit more aggressive in their questioning than they might have been, because now you have Warren over here who's talking about taking banks to trial. It allows some other Democrats to ask a little bit tougher questions, also so they don't look weak next to Warren.
And, Andrew, we are coming out of the financial crisis, but the banks are as big as they have been. Right. 12 banking institutions, or 0.2% of all banks, hold nearly 70% of all banking assets in the U.S. Why hasn't there been a bigger push to break up these big banks? Simon Johnson writes, "The true conservative agenda should be to take government out of banking by making all financial institutions small enough and simple enough to fail."
Look, I'm of the view that our banking system is still too big to fail. I would argue it's too big to fail squared in terms of the concentration that you talked about post-crisis. The question is, do we therefore break up the banks, and does that solve the problem? And I'm not sure it does, in fairness and in truth. Or do you decide that we're just going to have big banks and we're going to live with them? And the only reason I say that is you look at Australia, you look at Canada, you look at other places where they have a very concentrated banking system, and it's worked quite well. Having said that, there will therefore be an implicit backstop. And it may be that we just have to live with that implicit backstop. But if we're going to live with that implicit backstop, we then have to manage the risk around the banks. We have to manage the compensation around the banks. We have to manage all of that. And so the question is, which path are we willing to take? At the moment, politically, whatever you want to decide, it seems that we have decided that we prefer to keep the banks the way they are, given the way the economy is and all these other issues that we talk about. We talk about the sequester. If you break up the banks tomorrow, I promise you, that creates a whole other level of uncertainty. So, and I'm not saying you should or you shouldn't. I'm just saying the issues are much more complicated than the often sort of knee-jerk response, which is just break them up.
Well, but then what about Elizabeth Warren's question, which is, Harold, when was the last time a Wall Street bank went to trial? And, she actually, I thought, made a very fair point, which is that there are DAs and U.S. attorneys out there every day squeezing ordinary citizens on sometimes very thin grounds, taking them to trial in order to make an example, as they put it. And then goes on to make the case for why we haven't done the the same for the
It's a
banks?
question for the regulators to ask, and she had every right to ask that question. I would hope that we would also look at the accountability of these institutions and the standards. New standards are being held to, whether or not the new rules and regulations that have been written are working, and how do we prevent what we saw happen a few years ago from ever happening again. Put it in context, the big banks that received TARP loans have all paid them back. The government made a profit on it. Admittedly, an unusual way to make a profit for the federal government and taxpayers, but a profit was made. Indeed, the investment in AIG, the government is beginning, the American people, when you say government, are beginning to realize that back. So I just put it all in context. Now, going forward, I think what Andrew said is spot on. You've got to put a regime and a protocol in place to ensure that risk is managed better and that rules are followed more closely and that punishment is meted out in a quicker way. One of the tragedies over the last 5 or 6 years, there's no doubt about it, but over the last 5 or 6 years, we have seen a new set of rules and regulations. And one of the great tragedies was 7 or 8 years ago, some of the things these guys did were not against the law. So the fact that rules and laws have changed, I think, is a positive thing.
Well, Heather, today we have word from the Justice Department is now going to be it's shifting its prosecution strategy so that they're pushing now for guilty pleas rather than just fines, which actually seems to be a fairly big deal. It is something attorney generals like Eric Schneiderman, who have been at the forefront on this issue, have been pushing for a long time.
Yeah, it was a great piece, actually, by Ben Protis in the New York Times today, actually connecting these two issues about how it is that banks are too big to fail and how that means they've become too big to jail. And to zoom out a little more context, even, Harold, than you gave, yes, AIG has been paid back. The Treasury Department is in the black on it. But the American people and taxpayers and businesses lost $13 trillion. That will never be paid back. People lost their homes. Businesses are still not recovered from an entirely preventable financial crisis that did involve incredible levels of fraud that simply have not been able to be prosecuted because of the conventional wisdom that is the currency on Wall Street, that what you do to the banks, you do to the American people. And you do to the economy overall. The idea that you can't touch the banks because it's going to hurt the economy means that they basically have a get-out-of-jail-free card, and it's really hard to regulate, even for regulators, no mind prosecutors, regulators who do something that say, okay, this is going to cost a little bit more in terms of transaction costs. This is going to lower the profits and the bonuses at these banks if we have this regulation, but it'll be good for risk. All that Wall Street essentially has to say is, yeah, but if you lower our earnings,
right, you're going to hurt
what we're going to do to the economy.
I mean,
and that's where we are.
And this happens in even cases where it's sort of blatant criminality. HSBC got a slap on the wrist effectively for laundering money to Mexican drug cartels. Now, I mean, that's the...
Well, look, one of the biggest problems we have is the too big to fail, too big to jail issue. Because there is a real view, and I'm not sure it's a wrong view, but it's a view that if you were to decide that J.P. Morgan should be indicted tomorrow, and I'm not saying they should or should be for whatever reason, you got a problem on your hands, because not only are you going to have, I don't know, what do they have, 25, 50,000 people who are going to lose their jobs tomorrow, but in addition to that, the sort of domino effect of almost the sort of failure of a Lehman-like bankruptcy and what that means to the economy. So there are real issues, and therefore the question is, how do you regulate institutions like that? Can you go after individuals more forcefully than they have? I mean, it just goes back to the issue of we have not gone after individuals. Why is that? So there are things that could be done that I think, in fairness to Elizabeth Warren, she's raising a lot of important points in that respect. The question is whether that's more a show or whether it's actually going to create a real dialogue.
Let's close out with this question. There are comparisons being made, Ryan, to Elizabeth Warren and Ted Cruz as far as out of, grandstanders and people who don't know their place in Congress. A lot of people said, you've got to be kidding. This is Elizabeth Warren's bailiwick. This is effectively what she ran on. It's no surprise that she's taking this issue to the fore. Can she, you seem to think that she can open the doorway enough for other Democrats to be more aggressive, or Republicans to be more aggressive in their pursuit of reform in terms of Wall Street and our finances.
Right. Ted Cruz was asking whether or not Chuck Hagel was some secret jihadi or getting paid by the Iranian government.
Which is not something he ran on, I don't believe.
No, I don't think so. Whereas Elizabeth Warren is asking a simple question about when these banks have lost.
It's a completely unfair comparison.
It's
no comparison between.
But it's classic media attempt to find an equivalent on each side.
But her goal was to get the clip, right? Her goal was to get the clip and raise the conversation. I'm not sure her goal was to actually change change the dynamic.
So did she create the CFPB for a clip?
No. The CFPB absolutely is a real live thing.
You don't think she wants banks to be tried?
Well, I mean,
I think she does. I'm just suggesting that this, to me, and I'm not saying she was grandstanding per se. I'm just saying that you get into this kind of position. Ultimately, there's a practical element, which is you want to go to Washington and get stuff done. And the question is, what does this accomplish beyond this segment that we're having?
The seat she holds didn't belong to her, but she succeeded the great Ted Kennedy, who arguably was the most productive senator the Senate has seen in the last 75 years. Arguably a very partisan, arguably ideological, but by far the most productive. Why? Because he understood that the Senate and politics was about getting things done, and invoking the word that seems to be almost profane in Washington now, compromising with the most conservative of senators, including Orrin Hatch and many others, whom he was able to broker deals with and change the course of public policy in the country. That's what I hope Senator Warren is focused on, and I imagine that she is, based on how passionate she was in campaigning on these issues back in Massachusetts.
It's something that's been bandied about in the discussion of Ted Cruz. So you can make, you're in Washington, you've arrived in Washington when you can not only get the press, I'm really paraphrasing here, get the press, but also cut a deal. And certainly both of them have gotten the press. We'll see about the deal. Coming up, it is comparable to the narcotics trade and gun trafficking, the underground ivory market, and rise of elephant poaching is threatening the species with extinction. We will talk blood ivory with actress Kristen Davis and National Geographic's Brian Christie ahead on Now.